Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the first part of the series Advancing Disability Justice Through Sexual Violence Prevention, including disabled youth as stakeholders in our work. My name is Jessie Town Cardenas. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a consultant with Valor US, formerly CalCASA. I welcome you either this afternoon and hope to see you again for the second part, which is on Thursday, same time. And so we can go to the next one. We have, did it not forward? All right. We have some housekeeping and how to use Zoom. You know, none of us are familiar with Zoom at all, I'm sure. But just so you know, we'll run through this fast. We're not going to be using polling questions today, but we will be using the text chat for questions. Please do ask your questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll take some pauses between sections to answer those questions. If you do want to ask any questions anonymously, feel free to send them to Sarah or I, and we will post them in the general chat or bring them up during a question answer period. But we do want you to be mindful of your comments during the conference today. Maybe even just take a pause before you hit send, before you put those comments in, just to ensure that they are the ones you want to share with the world. And so that is questions in chat. You have a dial-in option too, if you need to use the dial-in option. We will be sending out the slides and recording as follow-up to this conference. And we have closed captioning available through our friends at Aberdeen Captioning. And, you know, as far as guidelines, they'll get a little bit more into this later, but just we know people have been on Zoom a lot. We know people are tired. We know that sometimes you just need to take care of yourself. Feel free to get up if you need to. Feel free to, you know, have something to drink and have a snack while you're on camera or off, and get up or go off camera as you need to take care of yourself. Next slide. All right. Oh, it's like halfway through the next slide. Fade in, fade out. Please follow Valor US on all the social medias. You can see them all there, and you'll get to see all of our important announcements of everything going on in the world of sexual violence prevention, intervention, and advocacy. Next slide. All right. So thank you. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Sarah, to set us up for the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Jessie. Hello, that's me. My name is Sarah. I use she, her pronouns. I am on staff at Valor US, formerly CalCASA. I'm a project coordinator. I work primarily on our rape prevention and education project, as this is technically an RPE web conference for California preventionists, although we have a couple folks from different places. So this is one of our biggest RPE web conferences maybe that we've ever had. So I just wanted to do a little bit of context and framing before we hand it over to our super wonderful presenters, just to kind of, you know, preface our journey that we're going to have together over the next 2 sessions. As Jessie said, we hope to see you back here same time, same place on Thursday. But, you know, what we really wanted to lift up is that as an organization and also as the anti-sexual violence movement, this last year and a couple of months has really reminded us of how essential it is to center our work to end sexual violence within this greater collective work of advancing equity and disrupting oppression. Because if we want to prevent sexual violence in all of its forms, then I think that the roadmap to get there means not only challenging violence wherever we see it or whenever we encounter it, but taking really concrete action steps towards radical inclusion. And not just inclusion, definitely not just inclusion, but also following the leadership of people who are most impacted by violence. And for this web conference, we'll be talking about disabilities, particularly youth with disabilities, who are often left out of the conversation about sexual violence and sexual violence prevention altogether. And I think one of the big ways that we can challenge ableism and all of these other intersecting dominant culture ways of thinking and being that we're all influenced by is really taking some intentional time to build the skills that we need to not only, create protective environments for youth with disabilities, but also to get ourselves just like out of the way, so that young folks and marginalized young folks can kind of lead the way and pave their own way and their own liberation, by using us and our resources as support. So I think our big hope for this series is that on Thursday, when we part ways, you leave, not only with a good understanding of the intersections between disability justice movements and sexual violence prevention movements, but also some skills to use your prevention work to actually, advance or uplift disability justice work. And so our presenters, who we're so excited to have today, are both sexual violence preventionists, are both co-founders of Indiana Disability Justice, are going to be sharing a lot of practical tools, a lot of resources and resource lists that we really hope is going to kind of facilitate and enable you to continue learning after we part ways on Thursday. When I first became familiar with Indiana Disability Justice and started getting the newsletter and attending web conferences, I knew that we had to invite both of our speakers on today. So we're just so excited that this is finally kind of coming to fruition. COVID might have delayed our plans a little bit, but we're here now and super ready for it. So without any further delay, we are going to go ahead and hand it over to them for the rest of our time today.
Thank y'all. Can you go ahead and go to the next slide for our introductions? So weird, the slides are like fading. Hi everyone. I am going to try to be mindful and speak slowly for the captioner. My name is Sky or Skylar. I like both. I go by she and they pronouns. I originally was a community organizer in Texas, primarily focused on LGBTQ communities and undocumented folks. I moved to Indiana in 2012, and I have expanded a lot of my work. I was the co-founder with Sierra for Indiana Disability Justice, which we started in 2018. For the last 8 or 9 years, I worked through the Multicultural Efforts to End Sexual Assault, or MESA. That was a statewide primary prevention program in Indiana that focused on marginalized and underserved communities. I currently, for the last 6 years, served on a board for Pedagogy and Theater Via Pressed, which is basically a experiential and embodied learning practice that we can talk more about later. I have a small art adventure, so you can see some of my art. There's a acrylic painting of a rose, and I do a bunch of ink art that I feel like is very intentionally connected between violence prevention, marginalized communities, and trauma healing work. And I also am a survivor of many kinds of childhood violence and adult violence. I am also a queer, trans, and intersex person. I have multiple disabilities, including chronic illness, and I am neurodivergent in several ways. Like I am autistic and bipolar and have other experiences with mental illness and neurodivergent. So that is a very brief summary of me, and you can see one of my dogs French kissing my partner, as well as other dogs. We have like a small pack of doggos who I also really enjoy doing trauma healing work with. So thank you.
Next slide, please. This is me, Michuksas Omne. Greetings, people. I'm so excited to be here with you today. My name is Sierra Olivia Thomas Williams, and I use she and her pronouns. And I have provided for you a picture of my beautiful daughters, Morgan and Anya, who are graduating from high school this weekend. Can't believe it, we got here. We are members of the now California tribe called Miwok of the El Dorado Rancheria. My twin daughters and I are salmon people. If you know the Cosumnes River, that literally, Cos is salmon and Umne is people, and that is us. My relations actually steward the North Fork of the Cosumnes River in the El Dorado Hills, and I know that there are some RPEs out there who are in the area, so I hope you're here. Our family includes Poppy Pupper and Maximum Cat, and I just love this picture. This is Poppy saying, "This is my life," because Maximum is really the boss of the household. I identify as a person with mental health disabilities. I'm on the bipolar spectrum, and I've survived many forms of violence throughout my life. My last incident was when I was 36. Survivor of child maltreatment and child sexual abuse and intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And, you know, I didn't always identify as a person with a disability, but over the last, I want to say 5 years, I've come to really realize the power of acknowledging disablement in my life and how sometimes things are out of my control, and it's kind of freeing to recognize that there are some things that come with disability that I just, you know, can't help. I've practiced sexual violence primary prevention with the RPE since 2005. I can't even believe it. That's like 16 years. And I did get to spend the vast majority of my time with youth, and not always youth with disabilities. It wasn't until 2009 that I started working with organizations that serve people with disabilities. Indiana Disability Justice is an awardee of the Rape Prevention and Education Grant, and it's so exciting, and every day feels new, even though I have been doing this work for almost 17 years now. I did spend a lot of time in the field as a crisis advocate, and it wasn't until 2015 that I had the privilege to stop doing that work and go into full-time prevention. And I just want to say thank you for listening to that short about me. And I actually want to take a moment to slow us down and center us before we get into this whirlwind of content. I'm really excited to connect with my homelands of now California, and I really, really want to dwell in that with you. So I want to share my favorite grounding and mindfulness practice with you. And it is about connecting to the 4 elements. And so if you could right now, get as comfortable as you possibly can. If it's convenient, take off your shoes so you can really connect with the ground beneath you. If you feel comfortable, close your eyes and just take a moment to roll your neck and breathe. Try to create space between your shoulders and your ears. Breathe your shoulders down. So let's get started with this grounding practice. We're going to start with earth. And what I want you to do is just take a moment to really feel gravity and acting itself on your body. I want you to press your feet down into the ground. Press your feet down and really feel the stability beneath your feet or beneath your seat, if that's where you feel more comfortable. Feel the connection between you and this giant earth and the stability that it provides for us, despite the fact that we are literally hurling through space, spinning. The same ground beneath my feet connects me to you right now, and I love that. So the next element I really want us to connect with is air. And so I'm going to ask you to take 3 deep, slow breaths. And when you're doing that, if you feel like it, you can vocalize when you exhale. Sometimes that helps. So I'm just going to do that with you now. 3 deep breaths. Feel your shoulders go down. The next element that I'd like to connect with is water. And so to do that, I'd like you to gather some saliva in your mouth. And if that feels odd, or if you are dry and you need some water or something to drink, go ahead and get some liquid in your mouth and really swish it around. Get that water and swallow it. Get that saliva going and swallow it. That's going to help with your digestion. But also, I want you to remember that your body is made up of tons of water, a majority of water. And this is connected to all of the water that is available on Earth right now. We're part of that nature. The next element is fire. And to connect with fire, I would like for you to please create some friction. You can do this with your hands. You can do this with your hands on your legs if you're able to do this. And don't create so much friction that it burns you. But once you get that heat, go ahead and place it somewhere on your body, on your chest or your cheeks, and feel that spark. That spark of fire is in every human being. And that spark of fire is in every spark across the earth. And it connects us. When you're ready, you can go ahead and relax and open your eyes. I want to say thank you for sharing this moment with me. And I'm going to pass the mic to Sky. We can advance the slides.
Thank you. Yeah, so I put in the chat that we don't have a land acknowledgement because we're all over the place, but there is a link in the chat if you would like to learn more about Indigenous communities in your area. So I wanted to give just a quick preview of the topics that we're going to address today. We're going to start with some of the frameworks that underpin this work. What we know is some of the statistics we have around harm against youth with disabilities. And then we want to go through some of the ways that personally and organizationally we can address ableism and ageism. And so we're hoping to get through that today with you. And then on Thursday, we want to look at how do you do outreach and collaboration with people with disabilities and young folks? How do we actually practice safety and transformative accountability in service and organizing spaces? And then lastly, how do we do the actual evaluation needed to continue funding these kinds of efforts, especially evaluation that is empowering and communal rather than isolating in an individual? Can you go ahead to the next slide? It's still doing that weird lag thing. Okay, so the communication guidelines we have today are that we're going to use I statements. You know, if you are sharing or one of us is sharing, we want to make sure that we're speaking from our own experiences and not trying to represent an entire community. I can't represent all people with disabilities or all autistic people, but I can share my own experiences in those intersections. Say it ugly means we don't want there to be a lack of language or a perceived lack of language to prevent us from having these kinds of conversations. As a queer organizer from Texas, I have probably heard as many things as people could ask or say to me, and I can promise you I would never be upset or offended. It's important to me to participate in the messy and complicated parts of this work so that we can all learn and grow together. That already led into we're all learning together. And then the jargon finger is this little movement. You can also put in the chat jargon finger because we can't necessarily see everybody, but that's basically a way to indicate to us that something we said did not make sense or you don't know what a word is. This might be important because one of the things that we have done is we have included a combination of community and colloquial language with academic and formal language. And the reason for that is because as someone who doesn't have a formal academic background, I often find myself really confused about how to look things up or what words academics even use. And so we want to include that language so that you know where you can get additional resources, but also make sure we are clear about how to model community-based language that is respectful to people. And then we encourage people to challenge themselves to both listen and communicate in balance. And lastly, the Jamboard parking lot, which I have put in the chat a few times. If there's a question that you ask that we ask you to put in the parking lot, or you just have a question you want us to address at some point, you can put it in the parking lot or in the Jamboard. And we will also have time at the next session to come back to questions that we may not have time to get to today. Lastly, some notes about context. So one of the things Sierra and I both like to do is be very upfront about our own processes for coming to this work. So we are trying to model accessibility and equity in our facilitation. And Sierra has had a lot of anxiety about this presentation and I have not. And so we agreed that I would do more of the speaking today than Sierra would, but we want to be clear that that's not, having equity in our facilitation is not a reflection of our respective input into developing this and being with you here today. You may have also noticed we have more content at the beginning than at the end because we want to be flexible about going through the materials that are important for you, but also giving ourselves time in the next workshop to come back to materials that maybe we didn't have time to get to today. Sarah and Jesse have talked about different questions opportunities. Also, if you have questions and you want to ask them anonymously, that may also be helpful for you if you don't want to ask the question on the recording. And then also, I am in my 30s and Sierra is older than me, so we are no longer the youth, but we were one day at some point, and we have also done work with young people. And so we're not here to tell you what youth need. We're here to try to help you build skills to ask those questions and have those relationships with young people. Because of our limited time, we are not going to stop for breaks, but please feel free to take breaks. And of course, since it's recorded, you can always come back and check out parts of the webinar that might be missed. Because we are talking about difficult things today, we wanted to upfront say we have some photos of things to show you historical issues, but we've been really deliberate not to just show really traumatizing photos. Like, we're going to talk about institutionalization. We do not have photos of people in institutions. They're very disturbing photos. So we have been cognizant of that. Lastly, after each section, we have both a set of resources and references. These are largely the same list, but we wanted to make sure that if people just want a clickable resource list, they can have that. If you like academic citations, you have that. So we have both of them. Okay, can we go ahead? Okay, so you can go ahead to the next slide. We wanted to start by giving you a framework both for disability justice, but also to help us talk about the ways that racism and ableism, as well as disability justice and racial justice, are intertwined in a US historical context. So first, disability justice is basically a social movement led by people with disabilities to create more access, inclusion, and justice in the world for all people. Mia Mingus is an amazing disability justice and accountability organizer, and she defines disability justice as a multi-issue political understanding of disability and ableism, moving away from just a rights-based equality model and beyond just access to a framework that centers justice and wholeness for all disabled people and communities. When we think about how to apply this, that means that people are valued for their humanity and not just their productivity. That we aren't trying to cure people with disabilities of their disabilities, but instead create systems and structures and social contexts where everybody is welcome and appreciated. Also, I think something that's important is that we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but we use the phrase quality of life a lot in like medical situations or service situations, and it's important that people get to define their own quality of life. Like having no chronic health issues does not necessarily mean that your quality of life is lower than somebody who doesn't have chronic health issues. And then lastly, universal design is creating institutions, structures, and other contexts where we are focused on creating the most access and the most inclusion, often for the people who have the least access. Let's go ahead to the next one. So I wanted us to start with like really thinking about how this shows up in our own minds and our own bodies. And so if we understand that ableism is discrimination or prejudice against people with disabilities, that seems very broad and it might be hard to figure out what that looks like. And so some examples might be when you're out and you see people with visible disabilities, do you experience pity, disgust, or fear whenever you see that person? Another example is if you judge yourself or other people for taking rest or not working. I think this is a really common experience because we exist in a capitalist society where people are seen as resources instead of humans for the sake of production and profit. And so if we all exist in that context, it can be really hard to appreciate ourselves and other people for just existing and having an impact in the world instead of just what they can do for themselves or other people. Another really concrete manifestation of ableism would be whenever people start projects or collaborations and they don't actually take time to figure out how the collaboration should happen, because there's an assumption that we all have to function in the same way or that other people function the way we do or that I do or something. And so that assumption often creates inaccessibility inherently. Can we go ahead? So something to understand is there's a lot of different models of disability, but there's kind of three main ones that I want us to think through. So these are the legal, medical, and social models of disability. The legal model basically says that disabilities are a set of deficits that impact the person's ability to work according to non-disabled standards. So from a legal perspective, the goal is to move people who have disabilities towards non-disabled functioning. It doesn't address the underlying reasons or the structures that result in that inequity. It just says people with disabilities are the problem, so let's quote unquote fix them. The medical model also is more of a deficits model, and it looks at how can we get people with disabilities to not have disabilities. So again, it's more of a cure mentality. And oftentimes this means that there is a value of some kind of standardized body functioning in that model. And then the social model, which has largely been advocated by people with disabilities, is that people with disabilities, there's nothing inherently wrong or less than the way our bodies work, but we are structurally disadvantaged by society's systems. And so the goal should actually be to end those structural inequities so that people with disabilities can live fulfilling, successful lives on their own terms in a society. This also means that social model of disability is really focused on holistic wellness and justice and how to support individuals' wellness in the context of the community. Okay, can we go ahead? Also, we'll stop at each section to see if people have questions, but throughout each section, you're welcome to post questions that we can either address in the slide or come back to. Okay, so there are so many kinds of disabilities, and generally, people might consider disabilities in these general groups. This is not true for everybody. You know, I'm not saying that this is the only or the right way to understand disability. This is just like a quick and simple way to think through different disabilities. So chronic illness and chronic pain are one area. Cognitive and developmental disabilities. So I would very much ask people not to refer to people with cognitive disabilities or developmental disabilities as retarded or mentally slow. Those are both really demeaning ways to understand cognitive and developmental disabilities, and also incredibly dated. Neurodivergence means people whose neurological makeup allows them to process information differently than people who are neurotypical. And this often includes different types of mental illness. There's probably people are most familiar with different physical disabilities, and then there's also sensory disabilities. I would also just note that a lot of deaf and hard of hearing folks do not consider themselves to have a disability, and they may instead consider themselves to be a cultural and linguistic minority community, which can be important, like to be flexible in how you refer to people, to be respectful. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so we wanted to compare and contrast primary prevention and disability justice. So these two frameworks converge and diverge in different ways. Some of the convergences are that both programs or both frameworks try to create holistic wellness for people. Both of them also focus on preventing harm by changing structures and institutions. So they're kind of high-level structural changes. And they both really address different structural determinants of health. Some of the ways that they diverge is that disability justice often includes policy change, but it's not necessarily seen as like the most impactful. And this was kind of reflected in Mia Mingus's, that quote from Mia Mingus about what disability justice is. But a lot of times public health models see policy change as like the most important or the highest kind of social change. Primary prevention as a public health model also sometimes means that it inadvertently supports a cure ideology. So an example might be that oftentimes in public health, there is a conflation between health and wellness, right? Somebody can have poor health, but still see themselves as having a lot of wellness. And so disability justice kind of delineates those things and understands they may overlap, but they also may not. Another important thing to think about is that I've read so many public health papers that literally refer to disabilities or race as risk factors for sexual violence, which suggests that people in marginalized communities are responsible for the harm that they experience. And I don't think that that's the intent of those papers, but it's a really important nuance and distinction that I want people to be aware of. Similarly, like obesity is often considered a public health issue. And I personally don't agree that your weight is reflective of your health, but if that is something that you're worried about, I think it would be much more effective and impactful to support people in identifying things in their life that they feel like is either unhealthy or that they can improve on, instead of just telling them that being fat is somehow a negative thing or unhealthy for them, whenever you don't know anything about their life or their experiences. Public health often looks at how can we scale the work? How can we expand what one group is doing to all of the groups or all of the different institutions? And a lot of times this doesn't work. I mean, a lot of community organizing and disability justice work is rooted in relationships. And at some point, if you scale something really large, like it's no longer relationship focused. And then the last thing I wanted to point out is sometimes there's divergences in the definitions of harm. For example, you know, there are lots of people who smoke, and we know that disproportionately people who are in lower socioeconomic situations may smoke. And public health says this is a negative behavior that we need to eradicate. And whereas a lot of justice movements will say, this is a coping strategy, so the person has some type of outlet so that they don't want to die, for example. And so from a justice perspective, yes, smoking may not be very good for you physically, but understanding that there's a more complex dynamic, and for some people, smoking might be risk reduction, right? So yeah, okay. Let's go ahead to the next one.
This would be me. We wanted to include two examples from the field of public health to take a look at and sort of put into the context of disability justice. And so the image on the right is a picture of the health impact pyramid. This is a framework that was created by the Division of Violence Prevention at the CDC. And this model is created for looking at different public health interventions and ultimately to improve public health. So at the base of this model are risk factors or conditions that increase the likelihood of injury or violence. And these things include risk factors like structural inequality, housing instability, poverty, and education. And these are described as the strategies that if we address it, it will have the highest population impact. And we want to point out that in this model, to access clinical interventions, which is at the top, this is very dependent upon someone's access to health insurance and money to pay for medication and prescriptions. And so I feel like in some ways that there is assumption with these, there are assumptions with these models that we are entering into a level playing field and that everybody will have access to these things. Just get your medication and take it for diabetes. And it's just not that simple. A lot of people have to ration their medications, for example, and that can lead into further health risks. So, and just kind of reiterating what Skye said about people using, so looking at long-lasting protective interventions, often we see things in here where people are using substances to cope with racism and ableism. And so we are asking people to, do better. Don't smoke, don't eat those French fries. And so we're asking people to do better for something like coping with historic ableism and racism. And, like Skye said, that these could be coping mechanisms. And so the bullet points on the left are 5 protections listed in the Strengthening Families framework. And this is very popular and well-funded across the nation. And these protective factors include parental resilience, social connections, concrete supports, knowledge of parenting and child development, and social emotional development of children. And so this is the guidance that we get from the CDC. And I just want to point out that the majority of the examples would be located at the top of that health impact pyramid with a smaller impact. And so we are being, as practitioners, the majority of what we have access to consider for strategies for primary prevention are pointing us to the things that cost us more time and effort and energy and are not changing the contexts. And so, behavior change related strategies like parental resilience are low-hanging fruit. It's something that we're comfortable with engaging with curricula, and we've historically been encouraged to use evidence-based curricula to guide our primary prevention strategies. And I just really want to ask if these strategies and curricula are accessible to people with cognitive and developmental disabilities. And in terms of focusing on resilience, are we asking parents to navigate the muck and crud rather than changing the context to make wellness easy for them and their families? asking parents to bounce back may not be equitable or ethical of us in our practice. So I just want to point out one other thing, that the protective factors like social connections and concrete supports, those things located down at the bottom of the health impact pyramid, are things that are politicized. And that is a huge barrier for implementing prevention strategies. And Thomas Frieden, who wrote the article about this health impact pyramid, argues that there's less political will to actually do the work of eradicating poverty, increasing access to education and things like that. Skye, I wanted to ask you if you wanted to explain the center CPS example.
Yeah, just briefly, I think one of the things we're going to talk about today, is the ways that racism and disability ableism are connected. And so I think part of that conversation needs to be, what are the ways in which our culture and our institutions are set up around a carceral ideology? So in other words, how are the ways that our systems incorporate prison culture into our services? And I think CPS is a good example, because any particular person that working at CPS is there because they care about kids, they want to make a difference, they want to make sure children and families are safe and healthy. But the actual system is set up for people to fail in doing that, because disproportionately we know that oftentimes CPS is not funded enough to actually do the prevention work and the support work to support families in getting out of violence. That instead it's often set up on a punitive system where disproportionately people with disabilities and people of color are disadvantaged by those systems. And while there is an increasing attention to not removing children from their families of origin or their larger extended family, there are still a lot of cases where kids are traumatized further by those kinds of removal without ever addressing the underlying roots of why the family is experiencing harm or dysfunction. Are you done, Sierra, with this slide? Okay, let's keep going. Okay, we have a few slides about historical context, and I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because I want us to have time to do other things. But really, the point of these slides is to understand some of the ways that racism and ableism have been connected across U.S. history. So one thing to note first off is that a lot of times in the 1700s, we talk about Europe and the US going through something called Enlightenment, which was basically the start of applying the scientific method to society. However, what also happened during that time is because there were lots of revolutions that happened across the world in the 1700s, including abolitionist uprisings. And in response to that pushback, people had to come up with reasons, scientific reasons, for why people were exempt from equity and egalitarianism. And so people used a lot of scientific methods, whether that was research or anthropology, all of these different fields, to find ways in which people were infantilized, that people with disabilities, women, and people of color were considered less than or not full adults. Can we go ahead to the next one? So a really good example of the ways that these are connected is in the 1800s, one of the cultural ways that mainstream privileged society pushed back against abolitionism, racial justice, and against people with disabilities was through different forms of propagandist entertainment. So, for example, minstrel shows, if you're not familiar, historically were forms of quote unquote entertainment where usually white men would put on blackface and would pretend to be people of color. And often these shows displayed Black people as stupid or less than. It was a way for white people to pretend that they were Black and then also display Blackness as inherently inferior. At the same time, there was a big push towards creating what were called freak shows. And so I think what people may not understand is that a lot of times freak shows were made up of people of color and indigenous people who were literally abducted, and also people with different disabilities that white colonialists found interesting or scary. So the example here is of this indigenous Laotian who was called Krau Farini, and she was abducted as an infant, and you can see on this flyer from the 1800s that it refers to her as the missing link. So this is a way that entertainment and science were combined in a way to cause dehumanization, because there was the implication that people of color were somehow closer to apes because there was a scientific exploration of evolution, right? And so people had to decide, why are there so many different kinds of people in the world? And so for a lot of people decided it was because there were different species of humans, but white people were somehow the best species of human. Can we go to the next one? Okay, and then in the mid to late 1800s, there was an increasing backlash to abolition work, and ultimately what that resulted in was the more systematic structural development of institutions that disenfranchised and harmed different people. So for example, the Office of Indian Affairs was established, and while some people might argue it was supposed to be like some type of advocacy organization for indigenous people, what it ultimately was a way for the US government to systematically cause genocide and dislocation of indigenous peoples. And at the same time, there was, because of the Enlightenment period, there was an increasing attention to genetics and heredity, even though people didn't really know what genetics was, but they understood that there was some type of intergenerational impact around disabilities and race. And so there was a big push to create what they called lunatic asylums, which I will again note are basically prisons for people with disabilities. And there's a lot of parallels between asylums and detention centers, boarding schools for indigenous people, and concentration camps, all of which we have had in the US. Let's keep going. So Sierra put this slide together, and it's really informative, right? So in the early 1800s, there was a big push to create what the US called Indian contract laws, which were basically a legal way, again, to dislocate a lot of indigenous people. And one of the ways that they did that was to claim that they were dependents and imbeciles. And so there was this very overt connection between perceptions of people with cognitive and developmental disabilities with perceptions of people of different racial groups in the way that they were defined at the time. We can go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, so this is also an example of basically where the eugenics movement started. So Indiana was the first government in the world to enact a official eugenics policy that resulted in forced sterilization of what they called confirmed criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and rapists. And despite the fact that Indiana was the first place to do that, this ideology was spread throughout many parts of the colonial world. And ultimately, one thing that's important to understand, since a lot of folks are from California, is that California was actually responsible for over a third of the compulsory sterilizations in the US that are at least documented. Sometimes there is the documentation and suggestion that in 1981 was the last legal forced sterilization, but it's important to understand that forced sterilization continues to persist in a lot of communities, especially people who are incarcerated, in detention, or otherwise lack a lot of agency around their body. For example, trans people in the US until 2001 were basically forced to undergo sterilization in order to access transition-related care. And many providers still uphold this policy, even though it is horrifying and also very outdated and no longer in alignment with standards of care for trans people. Yeah, and then just the last thing, this is actually on the left, on the lower picture, is actually a placard that people put up very recently to commemorate the people who were impacted by forced sterilization. Okay, yes, so we can go past the resources and the citations. Does anybody have any questions about the framework or context? Okay, people can put those in the chat if you have any, and now Sierra's going to do this section.
Yeah. So welcome to What We Know. We can go ahead and advance the slide. These statistics represent for us a "you are here" moment. This is the prevalence of violence against youth with disabilities. So across the nation, 5.2% of US children have a disability, and these children are 4 times more likely to experience violence than their non-disabled peers. And when you break it down into different forms of violence, you can see that the numbers change just a little bit. There's youth with disabilities are 3.6 times as likely to experience physical violence, 2.9 times as likely for sexual violence, and 2.5 times the rate of violence. They experience 2.5 times the rate of violence crime victimization. Children with cognitive disabilities are associated with an increased risk and vulnerability to violence. And the numbers are 4.6 times the risk for sexual violence and 4 times the risk for any kind of violence. And I see in the chat that there is a question about the when these stats were taken. So I got these out of a couple of 2021 publications. However, they are old because everybody uses the same 1990s information. And so I just wanted we will provide you with the references at the end of this section if you're interested to look them up. So I want to talk about this increased vulnerability for a second. And one of the factors that researchers cite for the reason behind such an increase in vulnerability is the added care needs that are placed upon families and caregivers, parents and siblings. And these add hardship to families, which increase toxic stress, medical costs, and lack of access to necessary treatment. So the way that this ends up looking like in practice, this happened 3 years ago with a stakeholder. They had this person with a disability who was receiving the Medicaid waiver and getting community-based services in their home that they owned, had a traumatic experience. They remembered it and were not able to then leave the house for a while. And they ended up missing 4 dentist appointments in a row, and Medicaid came back with saying, we're going to take this option off the table since you're not using it. Instead of addressing the harm that this person has occurred, it ended up being a punitive thing. And so So you might wonder with these statistics, who is it that is causing harm against people with disabilities? And the research, there's not a lot of it, but the research that is out there argues that caregivers, both paid and natural supports, are the people who are most often causing harm to people with disabilities. And then the next group to that is peers with disabilities. And then after that, there are less likelihood for strangers. A lot of this is due to social isolation. So this slide represents what little we know about violence victimization for youth. And we do not actually have prevalence numbers because states are not mandated to ask the quote unquote disability question. And the reason that in my advocacy, the Indiana State Department of Health always tells me it's too expensive. And so this transmits to me, and I think everybody else, that people with disabilities just don't matter enough. And the impact of this on the back end is less funding and less support and programs for people with disabilities. And so the state of our data that you see here is an opportunity for us to do advocacy with our state departments of health about including the disability question as an essential part of the data collectors that every state uses, like the Youth Risk Behavioral Surveillance System and the National Intimate Partner Violence Surveillance Systems. And another avenue for advocacy at the state level is asking your state to analyze and publish disability data if they do collect it. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide for sexual violence prevalence. Okay. What we know about vulnerability for sexual violence among youth with disabilities is that it happens normatively. It happens with regularity. 40 to 70% of girls with disabilities will experience sexual abuse prior to age 18. And as they get older, the prevalence goes up. Boys at this time are 30% more at risk during the same period than their non-disabled peers. And I was actually surprised at this third bullet point, that maltreatment is 3 times more severe for children with disabilities than their non-disabled peers. And what researchers were saying here is that the abuse and injury is actually more severe for youth with disabilities. And so an example of what this might look like is a child who uses a wheelchair or a power chair and does not have access to that and is left in their bed could develop pressure sores or be left in soiled clothing and develop rashes. And toileting is also another really vulnerable thing for people with disabilities and often need help with that really private moment by strangers on a daily basis. And another way that danger is increased is that mobility devices and accessibility equipment is kept away from people with disabilities. And so they literally may not be able to move or leave the situation. This is an increased risk for fire and abuse. Sky, do you want to add anything to these?
No, you're good.
Okay, let's take a look at risk factors. And I see that we need to speed up, and I took copious notes for myself here. And so I'm going to do my very best.
You know what?
Yeah.
Sierra, since we have a lot of stuff written out, can we actually just go to the next section and people can always look at this in the slides after
Sure.
the fact?
Yeah, if everybody else is fine with that. Yeah.
I think that would probably be good.
Okay, so are we popping ahead to section 3?
Yeah, I think that would be good.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of folks on this who do a lot of sexual violence prevention work will already be familiar with a lot of the risk and protective factors, but that's definitely also something that you can refer to our resources at the end of that section if you want to delve into it more. Yeah, so this section, we want to focus on some of the ways that ableism and ageism might show up in our own individual lives. And then the next section after that is looking at the organizational level. So can we go ahead to the next slide? Thanks. So what I basically want to convey here is that disability language is some of the most complicated language to address for people respectfully. There is something called master effect language that is generally always disrespectful unless it's like an in-group language, right? So you should not call people cripples or gimps or robots or crazy, right? These are all words that have a deeply harmful historical context and have been used as slurs or disrespectful language towards people in those communities. However, some groups reclaim language that has historically been harmful. Like I, in my own personal space, call myself a dyke and a queer crip. But these are like words that have been used against me and people in the communities that I'm from in a harmful way. And so I use those in a loving way to affirm myself and take back power away from the ways that I have been harmed. There are a lot of different preferences people have around descriptive or person-first language. We gave some examples of some of the different ways that people may prefer. In public health spaces, a lot of people prefer for you to use person-first language, like people with disabilities. But there's also lots of disabled folks who prefer descriptive language because, for example, as an autistic person, I always use descriptive language around autism because I don't think that person with autism makes sense. Like autism is not something that I have that I can separate from myself. It's not something that I want removed, and it's not possible to remove because it's just part of who I am. So that's why I would prefer descriptive language in that sense. Also because the phrase person with autism has a really disturbing history that I do not like to associate myself with. But yes, just note that like how people might want to be referred to themselves may depend both on their personal history, but also based on the disability community that they're part of. We can go to the next one. Okay, so we have kind of a big list of potential either slurs or disrespectful words. And we don't have time to go through all of these, but what I do want to point out is two things at the bottom left. So one is the language like suffers from or a victim of a disability. Those are really derogatory and condescending ways to refer to disability. Most people with disabilities don't necessarily feel like their disability negatively impacts their life, but I do feel like I'm negatively impacted by ableism and structural inequity. You know, I'm chronically ill and I would not choose to not be chronically ill. Like, not that I have that choice, but there's lots of things that chronic illness gives me a different perspective of. And, you know, as long as I have the tools to like manage my own wellness, like it's okay. Similarly, like there's a lot of euphemistic phrases that are really insulting. So, for example, handy capable or differently abled or special needs, all of these are like euphemistic. It's like, it's indirectly saying disabilities are bad and negative, so we shouldn't actually call them what they are, right? And that's the message that those kinds of words send. And so, like, again, I would just stick with either disabled person or people with disability, and then of course, like the community-specific language that people might need or prefer. Can we go to the next one? Okay, so understanding ableism and ageism, I wanted to make sure we talked about some of the ways these things show up in our language and our ideology. So one example around mind over matter, right? Like if you're a wheelchair user who doesn't walk or isn't ambulatory, you can't will yourself to get up and walk. You also can't will yourself out of cancer. So like using the phrase or the idea of mind over matter is very harmful. And like I said, like really insulting to people who don't have that choice and or don't want to somehow overcome the material context of their life. Intelligence, and standardized capacity. It's important to note that whenever we'll get back to that later, sorry. Intelligence, so I made a note on the right side about intelligence testing that IQ was developed in the heat of the eugenics movement by a French researcher, and that this was specifically used to try to assess who was quote unquote feeble-minded. It was very deliberately set up to try to identify and segregate people with disabilities into institutions, or like Sierra mentioned in a slide earlier, that there was even advocacy to literally put people with disabilities on like secluded lots of land by themselves, or like to be monitored or managed by a few people who were not people with disabilities. This has a lot of implications, intelligence testing, because it has been brought into schools, into medical practices. It was actually applied to immigrant processing centers whenever we started using those. And it was also used to strengthen the eugenics movement by connecting, like we said earlier, people of color and people with disabilities as less than. I want to point out that common sense is not common sense to everybody. An example that I use is that for many years, I did not understand why people use small talk. I thought that maybe everyone was stupid because everyone asked about the weather. And I was like, you can just walk outside and know what the weather is. And I realized at some point, like in my 20s, that small talk is like those CAPTCHA things. Like, it's like, you know, type this in if you're not a robot. Small talk is like that. It's like people being like, are you a human? I'm a human. And so when I started to understand that, I was like, oh, okay, this is why we talk about the weather every time we see each other. But that's not common sense to me. Like, I had to be taught that by probably my partner. Similarly, like the phrase adult behavior, I don't know about y'all, but like, I have experienced way more harm from adults than children. Like, there's nothing inherent about adult behavior that is better than the way that youth interact. And so instead of using the idea of like adult behavior, you might just say like, you know, respectful behavior expectations if you're like working with young collaborators or volunteers. I wanted to give an example for the idiot savant. People don't necessarily use that language a lot anymore, but I think the cultural idea continues to persist. And to give a quick example, like I'm hyperlexic, so I process language in theory on the upper end of processing language, whatever that means. But I'm also really sensory sensitive. So if you graded me as a human based on how effective I am at grocery shopping, I would fail every time. It takes me like 3 hours to do one trip and then I have to take a nap. But if you graded me on a standardized test for language, like I would exceed and pass and be in, you know, AP classes or whatever. And so the idea like of idiot savant, of someone being really bad at something, really good at something, is again, like it's weirdly segregated. Like everybody has things they're really good at and things they're really bad at, or things they prefer to do and don't prefer to do. And so the idea that like you can categorize people by those skills is very ridiculous and ableist because everyone has those experiences. Okay, we can go to the next one. Okay, so we wanted to include some questions for you to think through in your own time about if you've accidentally internalized different kinds of ableism or ageism. So the first example would be about qualifications and degrees. I have a bachelor's in molecular and cellular biology, and I ended up in this field in a really weird indirect path through my organizing. But I am very lucky that my first supervisor was like, oh, I totally see your skill set. You don't need a degree in this field to be effective. But most people like me would be screened out. Like I would never have gotten to do this kind of work if I had a traditional supervisor who believed in those kinds of degrees and qualifications. Okay, and then, yeah, if someone processes information or speaks differently, like how does your level of respect change for them? One time I had a doctor refuse to refill a medication and they forced me to physically go to the clinic to finish some paperwork so that I could get my medication refilled. But it happened over a weekend. And so I had the whole weekend going through withdrawals. And as an autistic person, for whatever reason, my reaction to withdrawal was to become nonverbal. Like I just couldn't say things. And so I had to go to this medical clinic. I wrote down like, hey, I can understand what you're saying. I just need this filled and I can't talk to you. So let's like write back and forth. And the person spoke to me like I was 7. And I was like so frustrated. I was like, one, you should never speak to anyone like they're an infant, except maybe actual infants, because that's good for their cognitive development. But like, I wanted to be like, I do national speaking things. Like, why are you doing this to me? But at the same time, like, it doesn't matter. I could totally be some random person who, you know, is a janitor, and I wouldn't want that person to be spoken with that way, right? So yeah, understanding like the way people communicate or you know, move through the world not only makes it might be different for them in the moment, but like it doesn't change the fact that they are a human who is an expert in their lived experience. And then lastly, I think something that's really important to think about is like how, whenever you are working with people, do you preemptively create opportunities for feedback? You know, I just started working with a new committee, and I started off by offering to let them know that I'm open to constructive criticism, feedback at any time. And I actually created like a Qualtrics form that is anonymous. So like if they don't feel comfortable talking to me directly, they can just send the feedback and I don't have to know who it came from. But I think a lot of times like people don't set that up in advance. And so that kind of transparency and accountability can be really important for healthy collaborative relationships. Let me go to the next one. Okay, I want to start off by saying we chose to use the phrase promising practices instead of best practices because I think sometimes the idea of best practices suggests that there's like a perfect or ideal way to do something, and also that best practices are disproportionately just research, which is not helpful for community-based work. And also, especially when we're talking about disability work, like working with people with disabilities, especially young people, is really an effort in creativity because people's needs may be different or even competing, right? So like I use captions, but I have met some folks with ADHD who find captions really, what is the word? Distracting, sorry. Some people find captions really distracting, and so it might actually like prevent them from fully being able to engage in the medium, right? And so sometimes, like if I'm showing a video to a class, I'm going to put on captions because I need to, but I also realize like there might be some people who are unable to fully pay attention to the medium with captions. So some of the ideas we have for relationship building. Just to remember that like the things that you see as conveying respect may not be what everybody perceives as conveying respect. Some people really don't like to make eye contact, and someone not making eye contact doesn't mean they're being disrespectful. Make sure that you take lots of breaks. I mean, thinking about like conference planning, usually there's only like 10 minutes between conference sessions, but like if you are a wheelchair user or you have to go to the bathroom frequently or you need to go back to your room to take meds or any number of things where your body does not function as fast as other people, like you end up missing a lot of information or material, or you're just left out of things. And so it's really important to make sure that breaks are spaced throughout opportunities, and that if you do feel really impatient about something, it's not inherently bad, but just to think like, oh, okay, I'm noticing I'm really like impatient and frustrated right now. Like, why am I having that experience? And trying to work through like, you know, I know for me doing grant work, sometimes the impatience is like, oh God, I have to get this to the grantor or I'm going to lose my funding. But that's not the fault of the, you know, the community collaborator who invited me to do a presentation 2 days before, but the grantor wants everything submitted 7 days in advance. So I'm not going to say no to the community collaborator, but I'm probably going to get in trouble with the grantor for not submitting all my papers 7 days in advance. I think it's always really important to check in with people and ask if they understand, if stuff makes sense, do they have any questions? And also remember that people may not know the question, or they may not know what questions they have right away. Like sometimes it may take people longer. And then of course, like for actual relationship building, you have to budget for a lot of things. So that includes time, expertise, space, travel, paying people if they are collaborating with you or giving you their time and their knowledge. I think we can go ahead. I think that's the last slide in this section. So I'm going to stop and ask if people have any questions or thoughts about the information we've gone through so far.
I just wanted to uplift a comment by Michael. I'm sorry, I just assumed gender. I don't know that. Michael commented when I was, I think, talking maybe about the health impact pyramid and what parents need. Michael commented, oh no, where'd it go? I wonder what impact respite care for caregivers of these children might have on decreasing violence. And I think that that is such a creative and innovative strategy that people should try. I just wanted to say thank you for mentioning that.
Sierra, do you have other things that you wanted to comment about that section? Okay.
No, I'm okay if we move on.
Okay. Okay, so like I mentioned, we are not going to get through this whole section today, so we'll pick up on this Thursday. But again, like if you have questions that you didn't get to ask today or you want us to make sure we talk about next time, feel free to add those to the Jamboard. And so yeah, we'll go ahead and start going through this for about 10 minutes and we'll stop so we can be done on time. So earlier in the framework section, we talked about some of the ways that racism and ableism are interconnected historically. And so we also wanted to go through what are the ways that that manifests now, because, you know, we exist in a context which happens to be a US historical context. And so history impacts the way that we function and the way that we organize ourselves now. And so it's important to be cognizant of those things so that we can figure out what parts of history are helpful and healing and what parts of history are harmful and we should work to change. So we're not going to go through all of these different ideas, but we bolded a couple on each section to talk through a little bit. So a lot of the ideas around white supremacy come from a document by I can't remember what DR work stands for, but there's a link to it in our resources and references. But we modified it slightly and also included how does this look in disability and racial justice frameworks as like opposing or contrasting ideas. So an idea rooted in white supremacy is perfectionism. And perfectionism can be really harmful because none of us is perfect, whatever that means. And because it's a completely inachievable goal, it means that it basically teaches people that you aren't enough as you are. And that's a really deeply harmful thing to internalize about yourself or other people, that you somehow are not enough to exist in the world or to deserve respect. And then kind of opposing to that, something that's really prevalent in disability work, sorry, can you go back one? Something that is used in disability work a lot is the phrase dignity of risk. Dignity of risk means that everyone should have the right to make mistakes. Having dignity of risk means also conveys to people that they are enough and that failure is not disqualifying to be a human deserving of respect. And that in fact, failure is necessary and okay for us to learn and grow together. Defensiveness, I wanted to bring up because I see this happen so much, even in violence prevention organizations. But a lot of times I think of defensiveness as like a projection of our own insecurities. I think everyone experiences defensiveness at some point, but I think of defensiveness kind of like jealousy in relationships. Jealousy in and of itself is not inherently bad. And to me, it signifies like, oh, I need to rethink, like, am I not getting something from this relationship that I should communicate about? You know, in the same way, if you've experienced defensiveness, it's good to stop and think, why do I feel defensive? What part of my identity is intertwined in the feedback that made me feel defensive? Who taught me those things to internalize that resulted in me experiencing defensiveness? An example of this might be, you know, there's a difference between saying I'm a teacher and I teach. And a lot of times if you ascribe a label to yourself, like I'm an educator or I'm a facilitator, it feels harder to receive feedback from in those topics whenever you've internalized that identity. And so kind of thinking through like, how did you get to that place? And then lastly, how can I practice being less defensive or working through that emotional thing that happened that resulted in me feeling that way. And taking ownership of like your own emotions, basically. And we talked about some ways to be open to constructive criticism earlier, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, so the idea of power hoarding or vertical leadership is when people in higher ranked positions feel like their contribution is more important than people who are ranked lower than them or who report to them. This can be really important to think through whenever we're working with young people who are already going to be attuned to the fact that they are disadvantaged by ageism. And often young people are used to adults treating them as incomplete humans or of having less important input and feedback. And so I think also it's important to think through the fact that power hoarding is often rooted in a savior mentality, or the idea that we are here to save poor marginalized people from their own circumstances, instead of understanding that marginalized people know the answers to their problems, they have the solutions, and we should work with them to accomplish their ideas. This makes me think of a quote from Lilla Watson, who is an Aboriginal organizer in Australia. She says, "If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And I think that's it's a really important way to think through how we use power. Are we leveraging it to increase our power, or are we leveraging it to create space for people who do not already have access to those kinds of power? In terms of, I think probably folks are familiar with the idea of individualism, and I think individualism taken to its extreme often means people feel like they have to be disconnected from their community to be successful in whatever that means for them. Mutual aid networking, in contrast, is an idea that is rooted in poor and poor communities and among people with disabilities, where everyone understands that our wellness and our success is rooted in our community practice. Mutual aid networking often takes the form of money, but it can look like a lot of things. For example, my partner and I were able to buy a house in 2018, and whenever we were looking for a house, we specifically looked at houses from a community perspective. We wanted our house to function as a safe space, which we've actually done many times now for folks. So we thought about, like, not just how are we going to live in this space, but how can we leverage this space to support the community. Similarly, like my art adventure, I didn't start sharing my art until very recently because I didn't understand how to make it financially accessible to people while also compensating myself. And over time, I figured out, I think, a way to do that, which is that 10% of all the profits go to abolitionist youth group in Louisiana. And some of the work, when it's collaborative with especially trans and queer people of color, I work with them to figure out how much of the profits they would like. So sometimes that means that I'm getting less than 40% of the profits on a particular art piece, but to me, like, I don't want to think about how can I be sustainable in capitalism. I want to think about how can I be sustainable with my community. Okay, we can go to the next one. Sierra, your face is so affirming. Okay, can we go to the, oh, yeah, go to the next one, sorry. Okay, this is the last one to kind of compare these things. So I notice a lot of times, a lot of my work very recently has shifted a lot into teaching and supporting white people in doing racial justice work. And I've noticed that a really big barrier to working with marginalized communities from a position of dominance is people really think they have a right to comfort. But that's not the case for marginalized folks. Like, if you are experiencing some kind of marginalization, you are probably very rarely comfortable, right? I'm very aware as a trans person that every time I use a restroom, people are watching me to see where I go because I'm the only out trans person in the entire college that I work in at Purdue. And I've actually had people ask me about which restroom I use because they are watching me, which makes me very unsafe. Like I constantly spend so much time trying to find restrooms that people aren't going to watch me in. And so instead, we should think about it as a right to growth, right? Like if I am working with people around racial justice, I don't necessarily want them to feel comfortable all the time, but I want them to feel like I am present for them to go through the messy and difficult and complicated process of learning and growing. And then the last thing I wanted to focus on is around the ways that we teach ourselves and each other to ignore our bodies. I have had some different young folks who have worked with me at Mesa. And one of the things I always do in the first meeting in our orientation is to tell them, you don't have to ask me for permission to take care of yourself. If you need to leave to take a phone call or to go to the restroom, or anything like that, you know, I'm not going to question, you don't have to tell me what you're doing. Like, I'm going to trust that you're a responsible human who knows what you need. But very frequently, especially people in lower ranked positions are forced to ask permission to just do really basic things for themselves. And so it's really important to think about how do we support people in taking care of themselves, and how is that hindered by our standardized professional processes. I think this is probably a good place to stop before our next one. So again, if you have any questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to add those to the Jamboard and we'll get to it on Thursday.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Huge thanks to Sky and Sierra. Y'all are incredible. We will see you all hopefully back here on Thursday, June 3rd at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.